Ukraine is headed to defeat in its war with Russia. The question that many people in Washington want to know is, if only we get this extra supplemental passed, then everything can change. We've shown you clips here where Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, has said that this is the difference between Western democracy. It's a historic issue that's going to change the dynamics on the battlefield. But we have somebody here with us today that can really shine a light on the reality of this. And that is Colonel Jacques Baud, one of our new very favorite guests. And so many of our channel love to have him on here because he is a former intelligence officer with the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, great military historian, and just a brilliant guy, frankly, and understands how things work and how they don't work. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in your show. Thank you to be back. Thank you.
It's certainly our pleasure to always have you on here. And I always love it when you come on because you number one, you always have new information that I never knew before. So I'm always eager to find out what you're going to teach us today. But you also understand how things work and the confluence between politics, policy, strategy, and tactics and economics, and how all of those are intertwined and inseparable to talk about what's going on in the outcome. And that's too many people want to stovepipe each of those things and look at them in isolation, and you just can't do that in the real world. So we're grateful to have you on for that reason.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me to discuss that, because what we are witnessing now is a situation that gets, in fact, worse and worse. It gets worse on the ground because the situation gets worse for the Ukrainian army. The Russians move forward steadily, slowly, but steadily. And on the political side, there's no exit. There is no exit strategy from the West. There is no exit strategy from Ukraine. There is even this kind of wishful thinking that Ukraine can still achieve victory, but we don't know what is victory. We don't know what defines victory. And the idea of defeating the one or the other, this has never been defined. You know, the one of the problem we are facing, and everybody is facing that, both the military side of the Ukrainians, basically on the military side, but also the West on the strategic side, is that they have never defined what is victory. In fact, the thing is that at the very start of this conflict, everybody was so convinced that they could make Russia collapse through sanctions that, in fact, they didn't even consider having a military victory. And that's probably the reason why we have discussed on this channel the famous interview of Alexei Arestovich, who predicted in 2019 that there would be a conflict in Ukraine because Ukraine needed that conflict to enter NATO. And in fact, it shows that the Ukrainians were ready to enter a conflict because the reason why they were so confident to enter this conflict is that they were convinced that this would not last very long. The thing is that the sanctions would be so massive, so sudden, so brutal that Russia would collapse within days. And that's, by the way, this is exactly, well, we are used to hear that in the French-speaking area, because the French Minister of Economy said that. He said, we make Russia collapse. And he said that within days. That means everybody was so convinced that this war couldn't last very long. And that's the reason why the Ukrainians entered that. And the reason why Zelensky came back in March to ask for negotiation with the Russians is that he noticed that what was promised to him was in fact false. That in fact the idea that Russia would collapse within days could not happen. And that's the reason why Zelensky considered that he had to negotiate with the Russians. And that led to the agreement, or half agreement
Yeah, the near
in March.
agreement in
Yeah,
Istanbul.
exactly.
Right.
Exactly. But the whole thing is that nobody thought about what is a victory, a military victory.
Right.
And
And
we are,
and I think one of the reasons, Jacques, why that continues to be the case, if you don't quantify what your objectives are, if you don't quantify what winning looks like, no one can hold you to it. So they keep having
well,
these just headlines with no substance.
that's true, but at the same time, you cannot define your victory, because victory basically is can be defined by the way how you achieve your objectives, or by achieving your objective is your victory. That's it, and it depends on the nature of your objective. If you have a huge objective, if your objective is the conquest of, I don't know, the whole of Russia, then it's an objective that you're very far away from the victory, because it will be very, very hard to. But if your victory is just getting, let's say, destroying the Kerch Bridge, for instance, let's assume the Ukrainians would say that's probably, by the way, what they have in mind, and the reason why they are so they are so keen trying to destroy this bridge, because that's very symbolic. It has
Yeah.
absolutely no military value whatsoever, but it has a symbolic value that
An
could
emotional
help
value.
them. Exactly. That could help them to define a victory, to achieve victory, because you have an objective. The Russians have defined their objectives very quickly. I mean, on the very first day of the offensive, the Russians and Vladimir Putin himself said, we have two objectives: to demilitarize and to denazify the threats against the population of Donbass. So they're a very limited objective, very easy to achieve. And in fact, they achieved them. The denazification was achieved end of March 2022, as the military said, the Russian command said. And in the demilitarization was in fact achieved as soon as the Ukrainians started to ask for help of the West. That means May, June 2022, when the Ukrainian army was destroyed. This first objective of the military. Now, the thing is that since then, since there is no agreement at the end of March 2022, the Russians have, in fact, they built their objective based on what they have achieved so far. So they will not keep the same objective they had before, because this one is already done. So now they
Right.
have
At least,
another
yeah, in those
objective,
areas. And then the question is going to be
which
how
is
much
probably
further will they
demilitarize the
go?
whole.
Yeah, because I think the big question is how much
Well,
further will they go? Were they going to say, all right, now we've achieved our territorial objectives as well as that? But I
they
want to
have no
shift over.
territorial objective. They
Yeah.
have no territorial objectives. This will still be demilitarization, but now it's demilitarization at strategic level. That means they will make impossible for Ukraine to have a robust military apparatus. That's point one. And point two, they will make everything, every effort to avoid that Ukraine could be in a position to join NATO. So
But
that's the two.
wouldn't you agree that they do have some territorial objectives because they still don't possess all of like Zaporizhia and even all of the Donbass? And it seems like they would want that physically all controlled before they would call a halt to this, wouldn't they?
No, no, this is not really the case. I
Hmm.
mean, remember that in March 2022, Russia was ready to abandon all the territories they had already. They were
Oh,
ready
that
to
yeah,
abandon them.
yeah, I see what you're saying. At the
So
greeting,
the thing
right?
is that today, what we are witnessing now, and what we are seeing is that they proceed very slowly, because the thing is, as General Surovikin said in October 2022, he said, from now on, we are not going to make big operations. We are just grinding down the
Mm.
enemy, the enemy who proceeds. So basically, we wait for the enemy and we destroy it as soon as it comes.
Right, and I
And
think that's important, and we're gonna talk about that a little later on because we have
yeah,
some interesting information to put on that talks about how successful that is already being and where we're going from there. But first of all, before we get there, I want to talk about the lack of willingness to acknowledge ground truth reality in lieu of the desired outcome that the West and Zelensky specifically has. Here about a week ago, he made this kind of odd comment claiming that the situation is kind of stabilized. Here's what he said.
We are at war and the enemy is serious, but let's be realists and not pessimists. Let's be realists. Now the situation is stabilized. Once we have weapons and concrete political steps from our partners, we will break Putin's backbone. I understand that this is not easy and everybody is thinking about oneself, and we are grateful to all our partners. But what we have now is not sufficient. If we want to truly prevail over Putin, if nobody wants Putin to drag the world into Third World War.
Okay, now that's a big claim that he keeps making, drag the world into World War III. That was a week ago. Earlier today, the prime minister doubled down on that World War III analogy.
If Ukraine will fall, the global system of security will be destroyed. There will be many conflicts, many such kind of wars, and in the end of the day, it could lead to the Third World War. And we should make our work. We should fight against of this absolutely unprovoked, illegal aggression of Russia in Ukraine.
So when we've had you on before, we've already stripped away this whole illegal and unprovoked nature of the argument. So we won't rehash that one. Go back and watch our channel because Colonel Beau's already shredded that one. But let's look at what he said there specifically, and also Zelensky implied a week earlier. If the Ukraine side loses this war, it's going to, what was the word he used? Destabilize the global system of security, and somehow there's going to be wars popping up everywhere to World War III. What do you say to that?
No, in fact, they are coming back with the same argument and the same narrative they had already last year. The point is that since last year, the Ukrainians noticed that the West becomes more and more reluctant to invest in Ukraine. By the way, this is a discussion you have in the Congress right now to know whether it makes sense to invest in Ukraine defense, since basically there is nothing, you cannot really change the situation, and every let's say reasonable military person can assess that you cannot really change the situation. The Ukrainians have not stabilized the situation. The Russians are proceeding steadily and slowly because they want to preserve their own forces. They want to protect and to keep their own forces. That's exactly what not Zaluzhny, but General Surovikin said in October. He wants to put emphasis on saving their own lives. So therefore, they proceed slowly. And what they have now is a kind of aggressive attrition strategy. But the whole thing is to the attrition of the Ukrainian forces. And that's why, in fact, they proceed not to gain territory, but to destroy forces.
Yeah.
And
I think that's the big, I think that's the big misconception. Because that's not how we do it. Well, that's not the Western way of war. So it's not in anybody's thinking. So the only way the Western war is like the big sweeping movements of Desert Storm, where my armored cavalry squadron was sweeping up north, or the 2003 blitz, thunder run into Baghdad that takes it. That's what they're thinking. So since they don't see that, then they think Russia must be doing it wrong, and so they're not succeeding. That's the thought. But really, I want to get to your point here a minute. You talked about what Putin had said at the outset, what his objectives were. He also said at the beginning of a couple of months back when he talked to Tucker Carlson, he reiterated what his current updated strategy is. Watch this.
I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, we haven't achieved our aims yet, because one of them is denazification.
I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism, but how? How do you do that?
This question appears to be subtle. It is quite pesky. You say Hitler has been dead for so many years, 80 years. But his example lives on. People who exterminated Jews, Russians, and Poles are alive. And the president, the current president of today's Ukraine, applauds him in the Canadian Parliament, gives a standing ovation. Can we say that we have completely uprooted this ideology if what we see is happening today?
You don't control the entire country. You don't control Kiev. You don't seem like you want to. So how do you eliminate a culture or an ideology or feelings or a view of history in a country that you don't control. What do you do about that?
We have it all in writing. Neo-Nazism would not be cultivated in Ukraine, including that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. This, it turns out, can be done during the negotiation process. And there's nothing humiliating for Ukraine as a modern civilized state. Is any state allowed to promote Nazism? It is not, is it? That is it.
So as an analyst, how do you interpret Putin's comments during that interview with what you're seeing on the ground? Do they line up, or are there any problems with it?
No, it lines perfectly up. The thing is that the Russians, the Russian military doctrines works after the principle of the that were defined by Clausewitz. So politics is a continuation. The war is continuation of politics with other means, meaning that when you achieve an objective, if you don't reach peace at this stage, then you can use the objective you have achieved to go a step further, and you raise, in fact, your objectives. As I said before, on the 28th of March 2022, but remember that was at the time that you had a discussion, and basically you had an agreement, a potential agreement between Ukraine and Russia. The Russian command declared that the aim of denazification was achieved. But the Ukrainians rejected or withdrew their proposal. As a result, we start from a new point, and then the objective that was denazification of the population of Donbass has become denazification of Ukraine. And that's exactly the same thing that you have now. At the beginning, the Russians were concentrating on the demilitarization of the threat towards the Donbass. But today, we can see that they have stepped up this objective. Now they are destroying power plant, for instance, energy power plant, all over Ukraine. Why that? It's certainly to create a strategic imbalance, but beyond that, there is also this idea that because the Germans and the French have promised that they would start building a construction plant for artillery device and tanks, Rheinmetall, the German company, promised to build a production plant for tanks in Ukraine. So what the Russians are doing now is to demilitarize strategically Ukraine by making impossible to have a military production. And that's why you have more and more attacks on economy centers and all that. The thing is that in the Russian mind, you don't go straight away to the maximum strength. You go step by step, so you can increase the level, you can increase the pressure. And that's what the West has not understood, because we, as you said before, it's not the way we wage war. We go directly, we destroy everything, and then we achieve victory and all that. But in a more conventional context, the Russians have probably a more, let's say, realistic understanding of warfare, and they understand that you cannot destroy in one shot a country large like Ukraine. So you go step by step, and you increase the pressure step by step, and that's what they are doing. In fact, since October 2022,
completely makes sense.
This is this aggressive attrition. In fact, it's not to keep terrain; it's to destroy and to demilitarize at a higher level Ukraine.
Totally get that. Their ability to wage war, whether it's at the economic or the military, both just knocking it down, while they're suffering limited casualties. I might also point out, as opposed to these big arrow bull rushes. Right now, the West seems to be trying to pin their hopes, and certainly Zelensky is, on getting this an aid package broken loose from Washington. And this has been going on really since September of last year, where Biden has been trying to get this big package and putting so much on it. He's putting all of his political capital on it as well. Here's what he said emphatically in February of this year. Sorry, I threw Gary
We
for
have to stand up to Putin and pass the national bipartisan bill, the national security bill, supporting Ukraine as they defend themselves against Putin's vicious onslaught. And prove to the world once more, America can be relied on. We stand strong with our allies. We have to remember who we are. We're the United States of America. We keep our commitments. We never walk away from our friends. And we sure as hell don't bow down to Vladimir Putin.
And then we had just a couple of days ago, I believe this past weekend, Richard Haass for the Council on Foreign Relations kind of trying to put a bow on this to try to say, no, really, we need to get this money out. And notice what he says is at stake here. And I want to get your comment on the backside if what he says is even possible.
I don't much care whether it's a combined bill or a separate bill, so long as the aid for Ukraine passes. That's the most pressing of all of that.
Right.
And every day the battlefield news, Joe, is awful strategically, but also on human terms. The idea that you have these soldiers on the front lines who simply maybe have a half dozen shells and they have to parcel them out to get through a day. You can't fight a war that way, and it's tilting in Russia's favor. This is recklessness and irresponsibility on steroids that we've ever reached this point. I'm hoping, and again, to me, it doesn't matter so much whether it's loans or grants. Just get Ukraine the military aid.
So his premise is, without directly stating it, is that just get them to say, because if you do, that'll change the dynamic on the field. What do you say to that argument?
No, I think the problem is you cannot make big things with something that has been almost half destroyed. What the Ukrainian army was in fact destroyed in May, June 2022. And since then, we have created kind of a patchwork army with equipment coming from different countries, different time, different obsolete equipment, non-functioning equipment. Even the Czech have recognized or acknowledged recently that they send equipment, or the Poles have acknowledged that they sent equipment that was even not functioning. So how can you achieve success with something, with an army which is which has no consistency, if you want? The secret of the success of the Russians is that it's a consistent system. It's a really, the army is a system where the people was trained for a specific doctrine, equipment was created and produced for that doctrine, and you have all the command and control situation that works for precisely around that doctrine. So you have one system. The problem is that Ukraine is a kind of hybrid system made up with different patches coming from different countries with no unified doctrine. It's half ex-Soviet, half modern NATO. We see that, for instance,
I wonder, Colonel, if I could just interrupt for a second. I wonder if you can explain for our audience who maybe has not, been in the military and stuff, why that's such a big issue, what you're describing there about the patchwork nature. Because people think, man, you're talking about Challengers, Leopards, M1 Abrams. I mean, that's great stuff. You just use them on there and you're going to get the same result as a Western nation have. But can you explain why that's not the case?
Just think about logistics. Just that. I mean, a Challenger, M1 Abrams, and a Leopard don't have the same kind of ammunition. They don't have the same kind of spare parts. They are not. Even they came with conditions. For instance, the Brits, when they sent the Challengers, they asked the Ukrainian not using those tanks in dangerous areas. So they are just able to, yes, because they were so anxious that the Russian may take a Challenger in order to study this the Chobham armor, which is apparently highly confidential type of equipment. So meaning that the Brits made very strong conditions to use or to not use the Challengers. That's why the Challengers were used. In fact, as long distance artillery rather than in tank battles. You also see that, for instance, because of the lack of artillery, the Russians, they have this doctrine that you use tanks, artillery, and all that in one doctrinal system. But it was not the case for the Ukrainians, because they have an hybrid system of artillery, both made of former Soviet system, that means massive fire artillery, and or let's say more Western type sniping artillery, which are totally different in substance. The kind of warfare is different that you can use with those you can make with those equipment. As a result, for instance, the M1 Abrams are apparently used as individual tanks. And you're a cavalryman. I was in command of a tank battalion, a Leopard 2 battalion, and you know that a tank is basically, it's a collective. It has to work as a collective entity. You don't use individual tanks just to support infantry, and that's what we had in 1916 on the Battle of the Somme, basically, to use tanks as artillery. Tanks as artillery pieces, or mobile artillery pieces. So, but that's what the Ukrainians are constrained to do, because they don't have the system that goes
they don't
around
have the system, right?
Exactly. So that's the problem. The Russians have understood. They have changed. When they started this offensive, the Russians had the so-called battalion tactical group, which was an extremely mobile system designed for operational warfare. I mean, in very deep moves into enemy area and things like this, and that's why they could manage to have these big arrows from the Russian border up to Kiev. They move very quickly through the Ukrainians without even fighting very much.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the BTG, as it's called, is extremely mobile, very strong with fire, but very poor in infantry. Meaning that when you start to fight in a built-up area, for instance, or in the forest area, or in swampy area, then you are lost.
Yeah,
and that's why
exactly what happened.
They had to restructure these battle group or battalion tactical groups were designed to defend Russia in the huge plains that you have in Belarus and all that. But it's designed for this kind of warfare on very flat land, no build-up area. When you move around very quickly, easily, you still need fire, but I mean, you can move as the whole system very quickly. When it comes to build-up area, then your tanks, they may be useful, but not as much as in open field. As a result,
and they're more vulnerable without the infantry support as well.
Exactly. Therefore, you need more infantry. And a BTG has roughly 200, 300 infantrymen, which is not enough to go into. That's why they had to step up a little bit their infantry capacities within their battle. They restructured, in fact, that. And that's what you could see in Bakhmut, for instance, when you had a mere infantry battle, in fact.
You're losing a war, and you can't.
It is what you have, in fact, in the right now. It's mostly infantry battle. It's not the big tank battle that you had in Kursk in 1943.
But now I want to move on from that, I guess, a little bit to what that means, because that is in fact for sure where we have evolved into. And wars are always, especially long wars, are always about who's adjusting better on the fly. And right now, Russia seems like they have got their stride and they're moving forward. So the question is going to be, like we talked at Zelensky at the Bursts, they're saying, hey, we're on the cusp of losing here, so we need this money to go in. But here's the problem with the Congress's money, as we can see in this clip. If you'll show that up there, Gary, this is actually a copy of the paper that was used by the Republican side in saying how they're going to allocate the money that they're putting out for Ukraine. Since this was published, it's gone from 48 to 61. But look, here are some critical parts of this, even with this additional here. 19 billion was going to replace U.S. stocks. 14 billion was going for U.S. operations in the European command area. You have to get down to 13.8 before you get to what Ukraine's going to get, meaning this is going to be an infinitesimally small amount of ammunition. And the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have both also been coming out recently and saying, hey, this is a math problem. We had, well, there's the one there. Will the U.S. let Ukraine collapse? Because they seem to be not aware of the math. But J.D. Vance, U.S. Senator, did say that the math doesn't add up. And so even if you get this, it's not going to make any difference. And that's the key point. Everybody wants to hang on to this Congress. If they just give them some more money, then it's going to make a difference. But it's a capacity issue. It's ammunition, soldiers, air defense, and those aren't going to be fixed with some cash. And I wonder what your view is on that element of will the supplemental save Ukraine?
Well, I think we are in a situation which is very similar to the one we had in April 1945 in Germany, where Hitler was expecting an army to come to help and all that. He had in mind armies that didn't even exist anymore, and that's it. Well, in the area of magic thinking, and this is a little bit that. There is nothing that we can do now to help Ukraine to reconquer the terrain they have lost, and there's even less chances to make Russia collapse. So we have seriously Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, the West has to redefine what is achieving victory. I mean, right now, because what we see, we see the Russians making progress on the map and all that. Okay, that's fine. But what we don't see is that you have more and more a problem within the Ukrainian army, and this is not new. I was myself involved in a program already in the 2014 already, because the Ukrainian army had already problem of people defecting to the rebels or simply deserting or committing suicide and all that. And we have exactly the same thing happening now. Even elite units. I mean, the former Azov regiment, which is now the 3rd Assault Brigade, it has been reformed, but even those guys now refuse to obey orders because
that's a big red flag on that. And it's interesting you bring up the issue of late 1945 in Germany toward the end of their war and what they were going in these. I think magical thinking is the word you said a second ago. Here's an interesting clip of Zelensky, I guess a month or so ago, talking to Fox News' Brett Baier about his next operation.
To continue our successful story on the Black Sea, and we will do it. I will not now go deeply to details, but they will get some surprises. I mean, Russians. Yeah, that's very important. So South is very important to defend East, where they have more than 200,000 soldiers, also very important to defend. And of course, we will prepare new counteroffensive, new operation. And of course, it's not, I'm not speaking that we will just stay. Of course, it depends on a lot of things.
So in order to have this offensive war, which is, I still can't believe I hear those words coming out of his mouth, given how the one in 2023 went. But in order to even have the theoretical possibility, they have to mobilize a lot of people. And there's some news in the CNN earlier today about this new mobilization bill that was passed. Here, if you can throw that up there, it says he signs in this new law overhauling their mobilization rules. And in this article, the CNN reports that the legislature places a new requirement on all men 18 to 60 to register with Ukraine's military and carry their registration documents with them at all times. The aim is to make recruitment process more efficient and more transparent, the government says. Zelensky's signing of the law came as shortly after Ukraine's commander on the Eastern Front warned that Russian troops outnumbered its troops 1 to 10 times. And if you're already down 1 to 10, if they're true on that, and then you think you're just going to get men from 18 to 60 and just grab them in large numbers and make a war work, that sounds just like the Volkssturm that you're talking about, that Hitler was talking about, creating armies.
Exactly. This is exactly that. The Volkssturm was, in fact, to use all available people who are able to carry a weapon in order to fight. The problem is that, and we see also more and more the difference on the ground, basically, because when you just take a youngster and you give him a rifle and you put him on a battlefront, I mean, this guy is just lost. And that's exactly, many soldiers have complained about this. I mean, Ukrainian soldiers, and in front of them they have Russian soldiers who have been carefully trained. They have rotation so that they are not always you don't have always the same people on the ground and all that. So it's easy for the Russians to fight soldiers who are totally unprepared for war, and you cannot just improvise yourself a fight, especially in this kind of conventional combat. And that explains also, because Zelensky also mentioned this operation in the Black Sea. But it's also interesting. I mean, the Black Sea, if you look at the theater of operation, the Black Sea plays no role. In fact, it's a land war.
A land war, right?
So what you do on the Black Sea is, in fact, just for TikTok. I mean, basically, we are talking about the TikTok operations, and that the same applies to those operations that the Ukrainian tried to perform in Belgorod and all that. They have absolutely no tactical, no operational value at all. It's just a PR exercise. It's just a TikTok operations. And what I'm concerned about is that Western politicians, they are happy with that. You know, they are happy to see that you have suddenly a boat that on the Black Sea that has been hit by some missile or cruise missile or whatever drone, but nobody asks himself, what's the point? I mean, we see that, okay, but it's just, in fact, the point is just hiding the fact that on the rest on the theater, all the land forces are just withdrawing.
So let me ask you this. Can you briefly just kind of explain what happened when Hitler did this same kind of thing in late 1945? What happened on the battlefield then, and what do you see is going to happen on the battlefield now once Zelensky starts bringing a lot of these conscripts in?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to make an assessment of what the Germans did in the last part of war. I studied a little bit the Russians' operations, I mean the Russian side, because in the Cold War we were very interested in that, because we knew that the Russians would try to replicate this. And by the way, as I was visiting the Voroshilov Military Academy near Moscow, I could witness that the Russian students, the young officers, were studying precisely those battles from 1944-45, those big operations, because these are the basis for the operational art of the Russians. So I'm not sure I'm able to provide an intelligent.
That's fine. But what are your expectations for this one?
But the thing is that what could be noticed is that the only thing that was, in fact, the driver for having those troops mobilized in 1945 is that the Germans were so afraid of the Soviets. And in fact, and you had most these young people and this Volkssturm and so on, they were used on the Eastern Front, basically. and that's where you had the most resistance. In fact, on the western side, the Germans were not so afraid of and they even tried to negotiate with the Brits and the Americans, by the way. But with the Soviet, they were so afraid. So we are probably witnessing the same thing now, and that's the reason why. Coming back to the conversation between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin talk about denazification because he understands that what holds the system in Kiev is in fact those right-wing extremists, because these are the guys who prevent Zelensky to move backwards and to push him. Exactly. All these guys that we see, these guys who have in fact were still in place, because those who have not been so right wing or so ultra nationalist, they have been removed. So the ones who are still in place are precisely the ones who in fact prevent Zelensky to negotiate and will avoid any type of negotiation with the Russians.
Which is bad for Ukraine. So in the remaining time we have here, let me ask you to do two separate things. One is tell me, what do you think is going to happen, say, between now and the end of the summer, if Ukraine gets this funding from Congress, and then what happens if they don't get this funding from Congress? How do you see those two things playing out?
To be honest, I don't see major difference between if they. I mean, I'm not talking about the bank account of the leadership, the Ukrainian leadership, but in terms of action on the ground, I don't think that will make much difference. The Russians have an advantage, a serious advantage. They will keep that advantage. I think that if the Russians receive that money, that will create an incentive for the Russians to move faster and probably to be more, let's say, to try to destroy more and more of the Ukrainian economy, basically, because they will notice, as they have noticed since end of 2022, that the West will not let's say sponsor or help to a negotiated solution. So that means that we are engaged into an endless war, and the Russians will make every effort to avoid that this war may be endless, and they will avoid any type of negotiation that will just destroy everything. So in fact, what we are doing now, by providing ammunition or help or military additional equipment to Ukraine, we are just accelerating the destruction of Ukraine. In fact, that's all.
That is hard to hear, and contrary to what virtually all these people like Richard Haass, like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, I mean, they keep telling us the exact opposite, and yet we see it playing out on the battlefield like you're talking about. And that's one of the more anguishing things to me, is that these people make these statements and they don't look that what they say is not happening on the ground. Gets back to what your original context was, that the West has no strategic vision of what they even want to accomplish. What does victory look like? They have none. So everything continues to fly because they don't expose it, I think.
This is exactly the problem, and in fact, if you look carefully, you will see that that's the same thing that affected all the wars we conducted in the last 30 years. We had no objectives, no concrete objectives. I mean, just tactical. We conducted wars at tactical level, so you just destroy point A, point B, and strong point A and B, but that's all. You don't have a strategic vision of what you want to achieve, and that's exactly the reason why the US, I mean, not just the US, NATO failed in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria. That's why the French failed in Northern Africa. I've been quite extensively in North Africa and in Mali, because I was involved in the school there in Bamako. But the Mali people, including the military, told me, but the French don't have any objective. They don't have a strategy. They just fight. They just kill people. But it's not a
Now,
strategy.
and I can tell you with 100% certainty, because I had 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, and I can absolutely vouch for what you're saying, because we had tactical objectives, tactical operations, but nobody ever said, ever, and I listened and looked for it, if the U.S. military or the Allied military forces accomplish this, that's going to determine the end of the war. That's what success looks like. It was purely, all right, you got 12-month deployment, and you're going to accomplish this while you're here. Then you're going to rotate out. The next guy's going to come in and you can conduct more tasks, but nothing about here's what victory looks like. Same thing in Syria. So we went into Syria for an attainable military objective to deprive ISIS of its territorial holdings in Raqqa, in Mosul. They did that. And then they stayed, because now then there's no more objective, but there's no in-state objective, and we're just there. It's horrible.
Well, and Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, used to say, tactics without strategy is just noise before defeat. That's exactly where we are. We are just making noise before defeat. That's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. Exactly what we are pushing the Ukraine to, because we never achieved a sound objective. I have probably to be just on that, in the sense that we had objectives, but based on false assessments, or a bad assessment of the situation of Russia, because we assessed that Russia was weaker as it is really. We conducted a war. We pushed Ukraine into a war that could not be a success, because we underestimated Russia. And that's also something that, in fact, Sun Tzu himself also said, you cannot just start a war by underestimating your enemy. And we are doing exactly the same thing. By the way, it's exactly the same thing that the Israeli are doing in Gaza. It's exactly the same that the Israeli did with Iran. We are always, because we have this kind of Western hubris that we are the best ones, because we have democracy, we had performing economies, and we have a higher standard of living. We think that we are superior, and we will just be able to win simply because we are a superior political system. But the reality is that a military system is a military war needs wage against an enemy. The enemy can be as good as we are, probably not with the same political system, probably not with the same economy, probably not with the same standard of living, but it can achieve success because it has an objective, because it has a strategy, because it knows what it wants to achieve. And that's exactly what we don't know.
Yeah, and what we do know is that we are just oblivious to all of these facts, and I just long for the day when rhetoric and actions will come into at least work together, so that we're seeking something that's attainable, and we're not seeking something that's unattainable at the cost of a great deal of treasure and men's lives. And that seems to sum up exactly what we're doing in the West here. Thank you so much for coming on today, Colonel. Always a breath of fresh air. And even though it kind of exposes some of the things that our leaders aren't doing, at least now we know the truth, and we know what's happening on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me in your show.
Always a pleasure, and we look forward to having you back again very, very soon. And we thank you guys for coming to us as well. We always value you. We are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth that you need so you can understand the world around you. And we value having you guys on here. And I see that you guys have been quite active in the chat today, talking back and forth to each other and whatever. And we always value that too. We go back through and listen to a lot of these after the show's over. Be sure and join us tomorrow on our now continuing episode there of the Deep Dive Intel Briefing, what we learned this week. We're going to talk to you about a lot of the things that you may have missed if you didn't catch all of our episodes during the week, some of the key things that you want to make sure you know. And there's always something new that we talk about Intel-wise. You're not going to want to miss that. 2 p.m. tomorrow. We will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.